Hello, I'm Timothy Snyder. It's August of 2021. I am reintroducing my little book on tyranny into the world. I'm doing this for a couple of reasons. The first is that there's now a new edition of the book. I've updated the text. It turns out that, as I suspected, the lessons in the book were not really about the Trump administration. The lessons in the book were really about us and our country. So we're still facing some pretty fundamental challenges. I've changed a bit in the book to help us look forward into the 2020s and into the 21st century. But more importantly, On Tyranny is appearing in October in a graphic edition with illustrations by the fantastic Nora Krug. These illustrations make the book, I think, not just more accessible, but also much better, much more profound, much more interesting. I find it so, and I hope you will too. So what I'm doing now is I'm revisiting the book by reading each of the lessons and thinking about the last 4 or 5 years, and also thinking ahead about how these lessons can still be helpful. Today we're on lesson 12. I'm outside, as you see. Today we're on lesson 12, which is make eye contact and small talk. This is not just polite. It is part of being a citizen and a responsible member of society. It's also a way to stay in touch with your surroundings, to break down social barriers, and understand whom you should and should not trust. If we enter a culture of denunciation, you will want to know the psychological landscape of your daily life. So I guess that formula at the end, the culture of denunciation, is a good example of where I was coming from in writing this book. I'm a historian of Eastern Europe in the 20th century, which means I'm a historian of some of the worst events that humans have endured, at least in the past few decades. And the idea of a culture of denunciation is something which is very familiar to me from my historical work, maybe not so familiar to Americans. The negative purpose of this chapter, of chapter 12, of lesson 12, is that we should remember that people around us can change fast, and that only personal contact with them can keep us afloat. The only way to understand what's really happening around us is to keep up the basics of a social life. But there's also a more positive way to read this lesson, a more constructive way to read this lesson. It has to do with making other people feel as though they're welcome. And this too comes from history. It comes from a dark moment of history. If you read first-person accounts of, let's say, Germany in the 1930s, or the Soviet Union for that matter in the 1930s, there's very often the heartbreaking moment. It comes before the worst. It comes before immigration. It comes before state persecution. It comes before death. It's the moment when the neighbor stops greeting you. It's the moment when somebody you've known your whole life crosses the street instead of making eye contact or shaking your hand. And it's that moment when people realize that something very bad is happening. It's at that moment that they realize that somehow society has turned. And so the point of this lesson is that as an individual, you can do your part to make sure that no one feels this way. If someone is an immigrant, or someone is of another race, or if someone has some reason to feel that in general or at this specific moment, they're being left out, they're being pushed aside, small gestures can make a big difference. Even more positively, the idea of making eye contact and small talk is about keeping us in the real world. If we just make sure we're making small talk with a few people every day, that we're making eye contact with a few people every day, if that's a kind of natural discipline for us, it's also a way of keeping us out of the digital world. It's a way of checking what happens to us in the digital world. It's a way of making sure that we can still deal with other human beings. It's a way of keeping ourselves human. And then finally, another thing about this eye contact and small talk, I get all the time the question, how am I supposed to talk to people who disagree with me? How am I supposed to reason with people who seem unreasonable to me? How am I supposed to deal with the former friend or the relative who takes views which just seem not to conform to reality? And the answer to this is there is no magic bullet. There is no way to solve this problem. But What we can do is we can remind one another that we're all people. And this is in itself very important. If you make eye contact, if you make small talk, if you hear somebody out every once in a while, at least you're reminding them that you're another human being. And even if you don't convince them, and you won't, you probably won't, at best you can plant a seed, and if other things line up, that seed may come to fruition later on. But even though you can't persuade other people, what you can do is remind them that you're a person. And because so much of what is wrong when a democracy fails has to do with dehumanization, this is already a big deal. So much of what is going wrong in our democracy and democracies around the world has to do with the ability of people, often with the help of the internet, to dehumanize other people, to turn away, to see them as objects, to see them as something else. So the small things that we do, even if we're not satisfied, even if they're a little frustrating, even if they're hard, can make a difference in that way as well. So this was lesson number 12. Thanks for being with me.